The morning Matilda Dalton decided she was done with hope was the same morning Paul Carver rode into Redemption Creek with nothing but a worn saddlebag, a gray-muzzled horse, and the kind of quiet dignity that made people stop what they were doing just to watch him pass. Matilda did not watch him pass. She was too busy dragging a barrel of flour through the back door of her general store, her dark hair streaked with silver and pinned back in a practical knot, her apron dusty and her expression set in that particular way that told anyone with good sense to leave her alone. She had been alone for 6 years now, ever since her husband Robert Dalton had been carried home on a board after a mine collapse outside of Tucson. 6 years of running the store herself, raising her 17-year-old daughter Clara and her 19-year-old son James, and listening to well-meaning women in town talk about how she ought to find herself another man before it was too late. Too late. As if she were a jar of preserves with an expiration date stamped on the lid. She was 43 years old, and she had decided somewhere in the last year that 43 was simply too old to start such things over again. The wanting was still in her. She would not lie to herself about that. But the wanting and the doing were very different things, and she had gotten very good at keeping the first one quiet. Redemption Creek sat in the Arizona Territory in the year 1882, a town that had survived its rough beginnings and was now settling into something more permanent. There was a proper church, a school, a doctor's office, 3 saloons that the preacher hated, a telegraph office, and Dalton's general store, which Matilda ran with an iron hand and a surprisingly warm smile when the mood struck her. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and with it, new people, new commerce, new complications. The territory was still wild in the ways that mattered, though. Men still wore their guns low on their hips. Disputes still sometimes found resolution in the street rather than in the courthouse. And the land itself was a force of nature that reminded every single person living on it that human arrangements were temporary things. It was into this particular town, on a Tuesday in late October when the desert air had finally begun to cool into something bearable, that Paul Carver arrived. He was 47 years old, though he did not look it in the way most men did not look their age out here. Hard living either used a man up early or burned away everything soft and left something elemental behind. Paul was the second kind. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with hands that showed a lifetime of work and a face that showed a lifetime of thought. His hair was dark brown going silver at the temples, and he had dark eyes that had a habit of noticing things carefully before he spoke about them. He had come from Colorado, from a cattle operation he had sold after his wife Eleanor had passed 3 years ago. He had spent those 3 years moving, not quite running but not quite resting either, looking for a place where the ground felt like it was worth putting down roots again. He tied his horse, a big bay gelding named Dutch, at the post outside the general store and pushed open the door. Matilda was behind the counter, writing in her ledger with the concentration of a woman who took her accounting seriously. She did not look up immediately. "Be with you in a moment," she said. "Take your time," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, like the first rumble of distant thunder. She finished the line she was writing and looked up. He was standing in the middle of the store looking at a row of canned goods with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way men did when they were being polite without making a show of it. "What can I do for you?" she asked. "Looking to stock up," he said, turning to face her, "and looking for information if you're willing. I'm thinking of settling in the area, wondering if there's any land worth buying or any work worth having." Matilda studied him for a moment the way she studied everything, with a practical eye trained to see past surface appearances. "You a rancher?" "Was. Also done some carpentry, some trail work, some rough building. I'm not particular as long as it's honest." She nodded once. "What kind of land are you looking for?" He told her what he had in mind, and for the next 20 minutes they spoke about the territory with the easy directness of 2 people who did not waste words. She told him about the Henderson parcel east of town, 40 acres that old man Henderson had been trying to sell since his son moved to California and left him with more land than one old man could work. She told him about the mill that needed a structural repair no one in town had quite gotten around to tackling. She told him about the water situation and the grass situation and the way the winters ran. She knew all of it because she had made it her business to know the town as thoroughly as she knew her own store. By the end of the conversation, Paul Carver was watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was leaning in that direction. "You know this country," he said. "I ought to. I've been here 11 years. She turned back to her ledger. "Henderson's place is north of the main road, about 3 miles out. You can't miss it. He'll over-ask, but he'll come down if you're patient." "I'm patient," Paul said. He bought what he needed, paid fairly without haggling over the price the way some men did, and thanked her in a way that sounded like he meant it rather than like he was performing courtesy. He put his hat on and went out. Matilda watched the door swing shut behind him, then looked back down at her ledger. She told herself she was not thinking about the way his eyes had paid attention to everything she said. She was lying to herself, but she was practiced enough at it that it held for at least the rest of the afternoon. Paul Carver bought the Henderson parcel inside of 2 days. He paid what was fair and not a cent more, which old Henderson respected enough that he threw in the small cabin on the property as well, which needed work but was structurally sound enough to live in while that work was done. Within a week, Paul had also negotiated the mill repair job and had started on it with the kind of quiet, methodical competence that made the owner, a man named Dobbins, feel foolish for having waited so long to address it. Word spread the way word always spread in small towns, quickly and with embellishment. By the end of the first week, most of Redemption Creek knew that a widower from Colorado had bought the Henderson place and seemed to know what he was doing. The women of the town, particularly those who were aware of Matilda's long widowhood, began making certain kinds of observations that Matilda found irritating. Her closest friend, Dorothy Marsh, who ran the town's only millinery shop and had a tongue that moved faster than most people's thoughts, brought it up on the Thursday after Paul's arrival while they were sharing coffee in the back of Dalton's general store. "He's been in twice more, you know," Dorothy said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Once for nails and once for lamp oil, Clara told me." "Clara talks too much," Matilda said without heat. "Clara is 19 and has good eyes." Dorothy set down her cup. "Matilda, he's a fine-looking man. He's a customer. He was looking at you." "Everyone looks at the person behind the counter, Dorothy. That is how commerce works." Dorothy made the sound she made when she felt she was being willfully misunderstood, a kind of compressed exhale through her nose. "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean, and I am telling you that I am 43 years old and I am not interested in starting that kind of thing over again." "Why not?" The question was so simple and so direct that Matilda was briefly without an answer. She covered it by refilling her coffee cup. "Because I am settled," she said finally. "Because I have a store and children who are nearly grown and a life that makes sense. Because starting over at my age is..." She stopped. "Is what?" Dorothy asked, not unkindly. "Is the sort of thing that ends badly," Matilda said. "And I have had enough of things ending badly." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Matilda noticed it. "Robert was a good man," Dorothy said carefully. "But losing him was terrible, not because starting over is impossible, but because you loved him. And loving something and losing it doesn't mean the loving wasn't worth it." She picked up her cup again. "That's all I'll say on the matter." She said it as if she meant to stop there, which both of them knew was not quite true, but she did stop, and Matilda was grateful enough for that to let the subject drop without further argument. Paul came into the store that Friday for coffee beans and a length of rope, and this time James was working the counter. Matilda was in the back, taking inventory, but she could hear the conversation through the open doorway. James, who was 19 and serious-minded in the way of boys who had stepped into the man-of-the-house role earlier than they should have, was asking Paul about the mill repair. I heard you're using a new bracing method, James said. Old Dobbins told my friend Tommy about it. It's not new, Paul said. It's just what makes sense when the load distribution is uneven. The original builders cut a corner somewhere and it's been working against itself for years. Could I come out and see it sometime? James asked. I'm handy with wood. I've been wanting to learn more about structural work. There was a pause, and Matilda found herself holding her breath without quite knowing why. Come out tomorrow morning if you want, Paul said. I start early. Yes, sir, James said, and Matilda could hear the particular note in her son's voice, the note of genuine eagerness that he kept carefully hidden most of the time, because he felt he had to be steady and reliable now that his father was gone. She set down the tin of coffee she was counting and stood very still in the back room for a moment. Paul Carver was patient with her son that Saturday morning. She knew this because James came home at midday with sawdust on his jacket and more words about load-bearing angles and bracing techniques than she had heard him say in a month. He ate quickly and went back, and when he returned that evening he was quieter but in the way of someone who has been given a great deal to think about, which was a different kind of quiet than the weight he usually carried. He's a good teacher, James said, over supper. He explains things without making you feel stupid for not already knowing them, Matilda said. That's a useful skill. He asked about the store, James said. Asked if it was always just you running it or if you had help. What did you tell him? I said you ran it mostly yourself since Papa died and that you were better at it than Papa ever was, which is the truth. James glanced at her. He said that sounded about right, looking at the books. He didn't look at my books. He said it figuratively, Mama. He meant the way the store is arranged, the organization of it. Matilda said nothing. She pushed the potatoes around her plate. He's a good man, James said simply and went back to eating. Across the table, Clara, who was 17 and had inherited none of her mother's reserve and all of her father's impulsive warmth, was watching Matilda with the particular intensity of a young woman who has drawn her own conclusions and is waiting for the world to catch up with them. Stop it, Matilda said to Clara. I haven't said anything, Clara said, entirely too innocently. Stop whatever you're thinking, then. Clara smiled into her supper, and Matilda decided that the problem with children was that they grew old enough to see you clearly. The October dust storms came through the week after that, 3 days of grit-laden wind that kept most people indoors, and coated every surface in Redemption Creek with a fine red powder that took the better part of a week to fully clean away. Matilda was sweeping the front porch of the store on the morning after the last storm when she saw Paul riding down the main road, Dutch moving at the steady, easy pace that seemed to be both horse and rider's natural gait. He stopped when he saw her. He touched the brim of his hat. Survived the storms all right, he called. 3 days of cleaning, she called back. But yes, you lost some roofing material, he said. Nothing I can't replace. He hesitated, which was notable because he did not seem like a man who hesitated often. I'm heading to the store. Have a list. Well, she said, gesturing at the door behind her, you found it. He swung down from Dutch and tied him at the post and came up the steps, and she held the door open because she was standing there and it was the natural thing to do. He passed close enough that she caught the smell of wood smoke and clean sweat and something vaguely like cedar, and she was annoyed at herself for noticing. The store was empty, Clara being at the schoolhouse and James out at the mill again. Matilda went behind the counter, and Paul set his list on the surface between them. She looked at it. He had written it in a clear, deliberate hand, which she noticed because most of the ranchers and farmhands she served wrote in cramped, half-legible script if they wrote at all. You went to school, she said before she thought about whether to say it. Yes, he said. My mother was particular about it. She believed reading and writing were the 2 things no man could afford to be without. He paused. She was right. She sounds sensible. She was the most sensible person I've ever known, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made Matilda look up from the list. His expression was not sad exactly. It was the expression of someone who carries a loss that has become integrated into them, part of the structure rather than an open wound. She recognized it because she wore it herself. She went to gather his items and he followed at a polite distance, looking at things as she selected them. When she reached for a sack of cornmeal on a high shelf, he stepped forward without asking and took it down for her, which she would have found presumptuous from anyone else. From him it seemed merely practical, the natural response of a taller person to a useful opportunity. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." They were standing close enough that she was aware of it, and she moved back around to the counter to put space between the awareness and herself. He paid and she counted back his change, and their hands were near each other briefly, not touching but near. She became interested in the register. "Miss Dalton," he said. "Mrs. Dalton," she said automatically. "Mrs. Dalton," he said without embarrassment. "Would you consider having supper with me? At the hotel dining room, nothing complicated, just supper." The directness of it caught her off guard. She had expected something more oblique, more easily deflected. She was used to oblique. "Mr. Carver," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I think you're a decent man, and I mean no offense by this, but I'm not in the market for that sort of thing." "What sort of thing?" he asked with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. She opened her hand slightly, a gesture that meant to encompass all of it. "Starting over. I'm 43 years old. I have a store and grown children and a settled life. I'm too old to go through the business of beginning again." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he was going to accept this and leave, which was what she wanted. What she told herself she wanted. Instead he said, "How old do you think I am?" She studied him. 45, she guessed. 47, he said. "I'm older than you, and I'm standing here asking." He picked up his bag. "If I'm not too old to ask, I don't know why you'd be too old to say yes." He paused at the door. "Think about it. I'll ask again in a week if you're willing to be asked." He went out, and the bell above the door rang, and Matilda stood at her counter looking at the door for a long moment. She was still thinking about it when Dorothy came by an hour later. "You look like someone handed you a puzzle with a piece missing," Dorothy said, sitting down in the chair near the counter. "A man asked me to supper," Matilda said. Dorothy sat up straighter. "Paul Carver." Matilda looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Because he's the only new single man in town and the only man I've seen look at you like that in 6 years. What did you say?" "I said no." Dorothy closed her eyes briefly. "Matilda." "I told him I was too old to start over." Dorothy opened her eyes. "And?" Matilda was quiet for a moment. "He said he was older and asked me to think about it for a week." The silence that followed was the kind Dorothy used strategically, letting the weight of something sit in the air without adding to it. "He has a point," Dorothy said finally. "Having a point and being right are different things." "Are they?" Dorothy said, and left it at that. The week that Paul had promised was one of the stranger weeks Matilda could remember. She was busy enough, which was normal. The pre-winter buying had begun, and she had 2 shipments come in from the supply line through Tucson that required inventory and organizing. James was spending 3 mornings a week at the mill learning from Paul, which she had complicated feelings about that she tried to keep simple. Clara had taken to helping more in the store, which was partly genuine helpfulness and partly, Matilda suspected, a form of surveillance. She thought about Paul Carver more than was reasonable. She thought about the way he listened, which was the thing she had noticed first and noticed most consistently. He listened the way people listened when they actually intended to use what they heard, not waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely receiving what was being said. Robert had been a good man, but he had not always listened like that. Few people did. She also thought about what he had said. "If I'm not too old to ask, I don't know why you'd be too old to say yes." She turned it over in her mind the way she turned a problem over, looking for the flaw in it, and the frustrating thing was that she kept finding none. The flaw she kept returning to was not in his logic but in her fear, and she was old enough and honest enough to recognize the difference. On the 5th day of the week, she was restocking the lamp oil section when old Henderson came into the store. He was a compact, weathered man in his late 60s who walked with a cane since his hip had gone wrong 2 winters ago. He bought his tobacco and his liniment, and then lingered in the way he did when he had something to say. "That Carver man," he said finally, "is doing right by that land." Matilda went on arranging bottles. "Is he?" Clearing the east fence line, fixing the cabin roof, talked about running some cattle come spring. "He works from sunup to sundown and he doesn't complain about anything." Henderson put his tobacco in his coat pocket. "He asked me about Robert, you know, about the store, how you'd managed it." She looked up then. "He asked you?" "He did. I told him the truth, that you'd built it up better than it was when Robert ran it and that you'd done it alone, which is no small thing." Henderson picked up his cane. He listened to every word, didn't say much after, just nodded. He moved toward the door. It was the kind of nodding that means something settling in rather than passing through. Henderson left, and Matilda went back to the lamp oil, and she spent the rest of the afternoon trying to talk herself back into the certainty she had felt a week ago. The certainty was not cooperating. On the 7th day, Paul came in for more roofing nails and a coil of wire. He set his items on the counter, and she rang them up and he paid. And then he looked at her with those careful dark eyes that had a way of making her feel seen in ways she had stopped expecting. "It's been a week," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. The store was empty except for the two of them. Outside, the main road of Redemption Creek went about its business, horses and wagons and the distant sound of someone hammering something at the far end of the street. "Friday evening," she said. 7 o'clock. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not the wide grin she might have expected from a younger man, but a warmth that moved slowly across his features like the first light of morning coming over a ridge. He nodded once. "Friday evening," he agreed. "I'll be here at 7. She had told Dorothy about the supper invitation, but not about her reversal, which meant that when Clara let it slip at school on Thursday that her mother was having supper with the new man from Colorado, the information arrived back at Dorothy's ears through approximately 4 separate sources by the time Dorothy herself walked through the store door on Friday afternoon wearing an expression of profound satisfaction. "You could have told me," Dorothy said. "I could have," Matilda agreed, sorting bolts of fabric, "but you didn't want me to make a fuss." "I knew you'd make a fuss regardless, but I was hoping to delay it." Dorothy sat down. "Wear the dark green dress," she said. "Not the gray one. You wear the gray one when you don't want to be noticed, and the green one brings out your eyes." "Dorothy, I'm just saying." She wore the dark green dress. Paul arrived at 7 exactly, which she noted because unpunctual people made her nervous, and she had not quite realized until this moment that she had been quietly hoping he would be the punctual kind. He was wearing clean clothes and a pressed shirt under his coat, and he had shaved, which had the effect of making him look both more formal and, she thought privately, somewhat better looking than she had given him credit for. He carried his hat in his hands and knocked at the side door of the store, which led to the family's living quarters, not at the front door, which indicated that he had paid attention to which entrance she used. James answered the door. He shook Paul's hand and they spoke for a few minutes about the mill, and Matilda came out from the back room while they were talking and Paul turned when he heard her footstep. He looked at her in the same careful way he looked at everything, and then he said, "Good evening, Mrs. Dalton," in a voice that was very quiet. "Good evening, Mr. Carver," she said. Clara was watching from the kitchen doorway with an expression that could only be described as triumphant. Matilda chose not to acknowledge it. The hotel dining room was the nicest place to eat in Redemption Creek, which was not saying a great deal, but Margaret Hooper, who ran it, was an excellent cook and kept a clean, well-appointed room. It was half full when they arrived, and Matilda felt the attention of the room shift briefly toward them, the particular attention that small towns paid to any deviation from established pattern. She had expected to find it uncomfortable. She found it merely noticeable. They took a table near the window. The waiter, a young man named Percy who worked for Margaret part-time and delivered telegrams the rest of the time, brought them water and the dinner menu, which was a single chalkboard propped against the wall. "Beef stew or roasted chicken," Paul read. "The beef stew," Matilda said. Margaret makes it with proper herbs. The chicken is good, but the stew is better." He ordered them both the beef stew and coffee, and then they were sitting across from each other in the warm lamplight of the dining room, and Matilda realized she had not done this, simply sat across from a man in a social context with no particular business agenda since before Robert died. "Tell me about Colorado," she said, because starting somewhere concrete was easier than starting somewhere personal. He told her. He had come up from New Mexico originally, he said, had worked cattle for other men for the better part of his 20s and early 30s, then married Eleanor, who had been from a Denver family and had the combination of refinement and toughness that Denver women of that era often had. They had built the operation together over 14 years, and it had been a good life, a full one. Eleanor had died of pneumonia 2 winters past, quick and brutal the way pneumonia was, and the loss had left him with a cattle operation and a homestead that made sense for 2 people and less sense for one. "Why did you sell?" Matilda asked. Instead of hiring hands and keeping it, he considered the question as if it deserved consideration. "Because everything I looked at there reminded me of her," he said, not in the way that would have made staying feel like honoring her. In the way that made staying feel like being stopped in time. He paused. "I needed to find somewhere I could build something that was just going forward." Matilda was quiet for a moment. "And you think Redemption Creek is that place?" "I think it might be," he said. "It has the right feeling, not too large, not dying. People who are serious about building something rather than just getting through." He looked at her. "And I find the company interesting." She recognized that this was a reference to her, and she chose to address it sideways. "You find the whole town interesting." "I find you particularly interesting," he said, with the calm directness that she was beginning to understand was simply his natural manner of speaking. "You run a business successfully in a territory where most women are not expected to. You know more about the land and the town than most of the men I've spoken to. You raised 2 children alone, including a son who is one of the best young workers I've seen, and I've seen a great many. And you said no to having supper with me because you thought you were too old, which suggests that you have one blind spot in an otherwise very clear-sighted view of the world." The beef stew arrived, and Matilda picked up her spoon and was aware that her heart was doing something undignified. "You're very direct," she said. "I'm 47 years old," he said. "I stopped seeing the point in being otherwise." He picked up his own spoon. "Does it bother you?" "No," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it. "No, I think I find it restful, actually. Most people take a great deal of time to get anywhere." He smiled then, a real one, and she saw what he must have looked like as a younger man. They talked through the stew and through the coffee and through a piece of apple pie that Percy brought over without being asked, because Margaret had apparently decided they deserved encouragement. They talked about the territory and the changes coming with it, about the railroad and what it was doing to small towns both good and ill, about the Indian displacement that the territory had seen and was still seeing, a violence done in the name of progress that Paul named plainly as unjust, which Matilda was glad to hear, because she had thought it herself for years and few men said it aloud. They talked about books, discovering that they had both read Dickens and had complicated feelings about him, and that they had both read a great deal of whatever came through on the mail lines, because neither of them had ever found an excess of reading to be a problem. It was past 9 when they left the dining room, later than she had intended to stay. The night air was cool and clear, the kind of autumn night in Arizona that apologized for the summer's heat with an almost excessive pleasantness. The stars were extraordinary, the way they always were this far from city lights. They walked back toward the store slowly, and she was aware that she was not rushing and that she was not looking for a reason to. When they reached the side door, she turned to face him. "Thank you," she said. "It was a very good evening." "It was," he agreed. He was standing at a proper distance, hat in hand, not making any of the moves she might have half expected. "May I see you again? Not supper necessarily. I don't want to make a production of it, just time." She looked at him in the dark and the starlight. "Just time," she said slowly. "That's all I'm asking for," he said. "Right now." "All right," she said. "Just time." She went inside. She stood in the small hallway and listened to the sound of his boots on the porch steps, then the quiet of the street, and she thought that she had not felt her own pulse this clearly in several years. Clara was still awake, reading by the kitchen lamp with the determined innocence of someone who has absolutely not been waiting up. "Good evening," Clara asked, not looking up from her book. "Good evening," Matilda said. Clara looked up. Something in Matilda's face made her smile, the private, genuine smile that Clara saved for things that mattered. "I'm glad, Mama," she said simply. "Go to bed," Matilda said, but not unkindly. November came in with the slow golden light of desert autumn, and Paul Carver became a regular presence in the periphery of Matilda's days in a way that was different from what she had expected and better. He did not court her the way younger men courted women, with the anxious performance of it, the gestures calculated to impress. He simply appeared, regularly and without fuss, as a person who had decided to be present in her vicinity, and was content to let the rest unfold at whatever pace it chose. He stopped by the store most mornings for something or other, usually something he genuinely needed, but occasionally, she suspected, something he had invented a need for. He did not linger excessively. He asked intelligent questions about whatever she was doing, listened to the answers, sometimes had something useful to contribute and said it, and sometimes did not and was quiet. He took James out on Saturdays to work the Henderson parcel, which James was beginning to think of as a kind of second education. He brought Clara a book he had in his saddlebag when he learned she liked reading, a collection of essays that had come through on the mail order 2 months prior in Colorado. Clara received it with the kind of careful delight that meant she was trying not to make too much of it. He came for supper at the Dalton house on 2 November Sundays, both times at James's invitation, which Matilda found both touching and transparent. He brought a contribution each time, a jar of honey from someone's hive he had bartered work for, a loaf of bread he had somehow learned to make on a cook fire that was better than any bread she had baked in recent memory, which impressed her deeply because she was an excellent baker and she told him so. "My mother taught me," he said. "She said a man who could make bread would never starve and never be turned away from a door." "Smart woman again," Matilda said. "Consistently smart woman," he agreed, and they smiled at each other across the kitchen table. James watched this exchange from the corner with a carefully neutral expression that fooled absolutely no one. December brought cold nights and the build-up to Christmas, which was a significant commercial period for the store. Matilda was busy in the way she liked best, purposefully busy, with a clear set of things to accomplish and enough interesting problems to keep her mind engaged. The supply order for the holiday season was a particular challenge, that year because the rail line had a delay out of Tucson, and she had to reroute part of the order through a different supplier, which required 3 telegraph messages and a letter, and a good deal of creative accounting. She was working on the last of the revised inventory on a cold December afternoon when Paul came in and immediately saw that she was in the middle of something complicated. "Tell me where things go," he said, nodding at the fresh shipment stacked near the door, "and I'll start moving it while you work." She looked at him for a moment, then looked at the inventory. "The canned goods go on the east wall, 3rd and 4th shelf down from the top. The flour and meal go in the back storeroom, right side. The lamp oil, I remember where the lamp oil goes," he said, picking up a crate. "I've been in here enough." He spent the better part of 2 hours moving and sorting the shipment, asking about half the things and correctly intuiting the placement of the rest, while she finished the inventory. When they were both done, the store was better organized than it had been when she started, and she had not lost half her afternoon to the physical labor of moving boxes. She made coffee on the small cast-iron stove behind the counter, because it was too cold not to and because he had earned it. They stood at opposite ends of the counter with their cups and the pleasant tiredness of shared work between them. "Paul," she said. She had started using his given name sometime in November, and it had happened naturally enough that neither of them had remarked on it. "Matilda," he said. She looked at her coffee. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it rather than respond to it immediately." "All right," he said. "When Robert died," she said, "the thing that was hardest was not the grief, though that was hard enough. It was the reconfiguration. Everything I had built and thought about had been built for two, and all at once I had to rebuild every plan and expectation for one. It took years, and I'm not certain I'm entirely finished." She set her cup down. "And what frightens me about this, about what you're offering, isn't that I'm too old or that I don't feel the right things. It's that I am afraid of another reconfiguration, of building something again and then losing it." The room was quiet. Outside, a cold wind was working at the gap under the door. Paul set his cup down. He did not come around the counter. He stayed where he was, and he said, "I understand that. I understand it better than most people who might hear it, because I've had it too." He looked at her steadily. "The only thing I can tell you is that I'm not asking you to stop being afraid of it. I'm asking you to decide whether the fear is bigger than what might be possible." He paused. "I can't promise you I'll live forever. No one can, but I can promise you that whatever time there is, I would not waste a minute of it." She looked at him for a long time. "You really are very direct," she said. "I really am," he agreed. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hands were quite steady, which she was glad about. "I think," she said slowly, "that the fear might not be bigger." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's enough for me." They finished their coffee, and he left when the store was about to close, touching his hat at the door in the small, habitual way he had. She locked up and went through to the back, and she felt something in her chest that she recognized, reluctantly and with a kind of wonder, as the specific warmth of a woman who has made a decision. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a genuine occasion. The town decorated the main street with whatever greenery could be obtained, which in the Arizona desert required some creativity, but also some genuine beauty: dried flowers and woven grasses, alongside the more traditional pine brought in by wagon from the higher elevations. The church held 3 services that the preacher clearly felt were only adequate rehearsal for the real performances of his career. Margaret at the hotel dining room put on a Christmas supper to which most of the town's unattached individuals were invited as a matter of tradition, because Margaret was one of those people who felt strongly that no one should eat alone on Christmas who did not prefer to. Matilda brought Clara and James. Paul was there, seated 2 places down from her, between old Henderson and Dorothy's husband Albert, who was a quiet, gentle man who had the gift of drawing out conversation in other people. Matilda watched Paul talk to Albert with the easy, genuine interest he brought to most conversations, and she thought about how it was one thing to be kind to women one was hoping to impress, and another thing entirely to be kind to the men who had nothing to offer in return. After supper, when people were gathered in the hotel's small parlor with coffee and the modest celebration of the season, Paul found a moment to stand near her without making a production of it. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas," she said. "I have something for you," he said. "It's at the store being my cabin. I didn't want to bring it here." She raised an eyebrow. "You could have brought it to the house." "I wanted to," he said, "but it felt forward leaving something at your house." "And what is it?" "Come see," he said, "tomorrow morning, if you're willing." She told James and Clara she was calling on Paul's property to see how the cabin improvements were coming along, which was technically true in that she was indeed going to the property. James's expression indicated that he was not deceived. Clara kissed her cheek. The morning after Christmas was brilliantly clear, the kind of cold, clear morning that the desert produced in winter that felt like the world had been washed and reset. Matilda rode out on her roan mare, following the north road 3 miles to the Henderson parcel, now properly the Carver parcel, and as she came up the lane she could see how much work Paul had done in 2 months. The fence line was repaired and tight. The small barn had a new roof section visible from the lane. The cabin itself had been repointed and re-roofed and the porch straightened, and someone, she could only assume Paul had planted something along the south-facing wall that would come up green in the spring. He came out to meet her when he heard the horse, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked at her in the morning light with the expression that she had come to know over the past 2 months, the particular warmth of it. "Come inside," he said. "The coffee's on." The cabin was small but well arranged, with the orderly organization of a man who thought carefully about how space worked. Books were stacked on a shelf he had built himself. The furniture was minimal but sturdy. A fire was burning in the hearth. On the table was a small wooden box, clearly made by hand, the grain of the wood smooth to a near polish. He picked it up and held it out to her. She opened it. Inside, nestled in a piece of cloth, was a small carved figure, a woman standing straight and clear-eyed, rendered in pale wood with the kind of careful detail that took genuine skill. She could not quite say it looked like her, but it had something of her in it, the posture of it, the quality of the stance. "I made it," he said. "I carve sometimes, when I have something specific in mind." She looked at it for a long time. The figure was perhaps 3 inches tall, simple but not plain, with the character of something made with intention. "Paul," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I was going to say that it's beautiful," she said, "and that it is the most thoughtful gift I've received in a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad." They had coffee by the fire, and she stayed long enough that the morning became midday, and they talked about the coming year and what it might hold, the store and the cattle he was planning to bring in come spring, the territory and its changes, the way Redemption Creek was growing and what that might mean. They talked the way people talk when they are comfortable with each other, moving between subjects without anxiety, allowing silences when silences were warranted. When she stood to leave, he walked her to her horse. He helped her mount with the natural, practical courtesy of a man raised to be useful rather than performative. She looked down at him from the saddle. He looked up at her. "I'd like to keep doing this," she said. "So would I," he said. She rode back to town with the carved figure in her coat pocket and the winter sun warm on her face, and she thought that perhaps the fear was quite considerably smaller than she had supposed. January brought the new year of 1883, and with it, the particular clarity that comes after the festivity of December settles down, and the world reasserts its ordinary demands. The store was quieter in January, which gave Matilda time to think, and what she was thinking about increasingly was Paul. She recognized the shape of it now, the falling. She had fallen in love with Robert long ago, and it had had a different texture, the passionate urgency of youth, the speed of it. This was slower, which was appropriate, she supposed, but it was no less certain. It was like watching a landscape reveal itself as you moved toward it, detail by detail, each new thing adding to and deepening the picture. She knew now the way he took his coffee, black, no sugar. She knew that he read late and rose early, and that there was no contradiction in this, because he needed less sleep than she did, which she had learned when he mentioned having read half of an essay collection before falling asleep, and she had looked at how much of the collection he had described. She knew that he had a small scar on his left hand from a wire fencing accident years ago, and that he was slightly better at mathematics in his head than she was, though not by as much as he was initially startled to discover. She knew that his laugh was rare, but when it came, was one of those laughs that filled the space it occupied. She knew that he thought about things carefully and spoke about them honestly, and that these two together, in her experience, were as rare as good water in the desert. In January, he started coming for Sunday supper regularly, no longer by James's invitation, but simply as an understood arrangement. He always brought something, always helped clear, always stayed long enough to be genuinely present but not so long as to overstay. Clara had fully adopted him as an ally on the question of the essay collection, which had generated a Tuesday afternoon exchange of opinions between them that went on for 2 hours and that Matilda, working on accounts nearby, found privately delightful. James had taken on a proper apprenticeship arrangement with Paul for the structural carpentry work, and they were by January working on a commission for a new building on the west end of town, a storage facility for the grain merchant. The income from this commission was going to James, which Paul had arranged with the straightforward reasoning that it was James's work and James should be paid for it. Matilda had heard about this arrangement from James, who mentioned it with the particular mix of pride and gratefulness that she recognized as her son beginning to understand the difference between a man who was kind and a man who was good. On a cold Saturday in late January, Paul came to the store and found Matilda alone and doing something she rarely let herself do in working hours, sitting at the counter with her hands around a warm cup, doing nothing in particular. It had been a slow day and she had finished the accounts and the restocking, and she had, for once, decided not to manufacture something to be busy with. Paul came in, took one look at her and said, "Good, you're resting." "I'm not resting," she said. "I'm thinking." "What about?" She looked at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat across the counter from her. She wrapped both hands around her cup and chose directness because she had learned from watching him that directness had less cost than its alternative. "I think I'm in love with you," she said. "I'm not certain yet because I've been very careful about being certain, but I think that's what this is." He was very still for a moment. "Matilda, I'm telling you because I've been sitting here thinking that I've spent a great deal of my life being careful and patient and waiting until I was sure of things. And I'm 43 years old, and I'm less interested in waiting until I'm sure of things than I used to be." She looked at him steadily. "So I wanted to say it now while I was thinking it." He came around the counter. He stood in front of her and he took both of her hands, the cup between them, and he held them carefully. "I've been in love with you since October," he said. "Since the day you gave me better information about this town in 20 minutes than I could have gotten from a month of asking around. Since the way you looked when you were doing your accounting and had no idea anyone was watching." He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. "I didn't want to say it too soon and frighten you away." "You've been very patient," she said. "I'm 47 years old," he said. "I told you I'm patient." She laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, one she had not expected, and it filled the quiet store with warmth. He raised her hands and pressed his lips to them, not a theatrical gesture but a deliberate one, and when he looked up there was everything she needed to see there. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We take our time," he said, "and we do it right." February was warmer than usual, the sort of winter reprieve that Arizonans knew better than to trust but nonetheless enjoyed. Paul took Matilda riding on a Sunday afternoon when the air was almost mild, out past the town limits and into the open desert where the saguaro stood sentinel, and the land rolled away in colors of red and gold and deep sage green. They rode side by side at the easy pace that Dutch and her roan mare seemed to have negotiated between themselves, and they talked and were silent in turns, and the silence was the kind that required no management. She told him about Robert, which she had not done fully before. She told him the good of it, the genuine love of the first years and the companionable steadiness of the middle years, and the particular grief of losing someone you have built your life around. She did not perform the telling, she simply told it, and he listened the way he listened to everything, completely and without interruption. He told her about Alina the same way. The 14 years of it, the partnership that had worked well, the mutual respect and the shared work and the ways she had made him better, the specific quality of that grief. "I think," Paul said when they had been quiet for a while, "that loving someone well once makes you capable of loving someone better the second time, not because the first was a rehearsal but because you know more." Matilda considered this. "I think that might be true," she said, "and I think it might also be frightening for exactly that reason." "Because you know what you're risking," he said. "Yes. Still," he said, "it seems worth it." She looked at the open desert, the extraordinary vastness of it, the way the mountains sat on the horizon like a promise. "Yes," she said, "it seems worth it." He proposed to her in March in the store, on a Wednesday morning before any customers had arrived, and while James was still at the cabin working on a frame repair, and Clara was at the schoolhouse. He did not make a production of it in the way she might have feared. No kneeling, no speech. He simply came in with a ring he had ordered through the mail, a plain gold band with a small turquoise stone, because he had thought turquoise suited the desert and suited her, and he set it on the counter between them. "Marry me," he said. "I'd like to be your husband, and I'd like you to be my wife, and I would like to spend however long we have doing this properly." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. 6 months ago she had told him she was too old to start over. He had said he was older and asked her to start with him. She picked up the ring. "Yes," she said. He came around the counter and she stood up from her stool and he took her face in both of his hands and kissed her, careful and certain, and she thought this is the best kind of beginning, the kind you walk into clear-eyed. James took the news with a gravity that immediately dissolved into something closer to relief, as if he had been holding his breath for months waiting for the resolution. He shook Paul's hand, and then, in a gesture so quickly contained that Matilda almost missed it, blinked very hard. She chose not to remark on this. She simply squeezed his arm as she passed. Clara cried openly and happily and hugged both of them in turn, and declared that she had known since October, which Matilda was forced to acknowledge was probably accurate. Dorothy's reaction required no description. Suffice to say that the information was distributed throughout Redemption Creek within the hour. The wedding was set for late April, when the desert was at its most beautiful before the summer heat came in, and when the wildflowers that came briefly and brilliantly to the Arizona landscape would be in their short season. Matilda did not want a large ceremony, and Paul had no particular opinion on size beyond wanting the people they cared about there. So they settled on a small afternoon service at the church, followed by a supper at the hotel dining room, where Margaret immediately began planning a menu of considerable ambition. The weeks before the wedding were full in the way that weddings made weeks full, with logistics and preparations, and the particular pleasure of a community that has adopted an occasion as its own. Dorothy made her a new dress, the same dark green shade that Paul had first seen her in, because Dorothy felt strongly about symbolism. Henderson sent a gift of a new harness and bridle set for Dutch, which was so practically thoughtful that Matilda liked him better for it than she had already. There was also the practical matter of how they would live after the wedding, which they discussed with the same directness they brought to everything. The store needed to remain operational and could not be left without someone reliable running it. Paul's property was 3 miles out. They agreed that they would alternate between the two locations during the transition period, and that James, who was 19 and capable, would take on more formal responsibility for the store, with Matilda remaining the owner and primary operator, but with James as her deputy. They agreed that come summer they would build on an addition to the cabin that would make it large enough for a family, which was the word Paul used carefully, and which Matilda heard carefully, and neither of them addressed directly, but both of them understood. The morning of the wedding was exactly what the desert promised in late April, warm and golden and smelling of sage and the distant sweetness of the wildflowers that had come in after the winter rains. Matilda dressed in the green dress with Dorothy's help and looked at herself in the small mirror in her bedroom, and she thought that she looked like herself, which was what she had hoped. "You look wonderful," Dorothy said, making final adjustments. "I look 43 years old," Matilda said. "Which is what you are," Dorothy said, without patience for false modesty. "And that man out there is 47 and has been looking at you like you hung the moon since October, so I think you can rest easy on the question of how you look." She stood at the back of the church with James beside her, because James had asked if he could walk her down the aisle in the way that felt right to both of them, not to give her away, he said quietly before they went in, but to walk with her. "That's exactly right," she told him. Paul was at the front of the church looking at the door when it opened, and when she came through it, his expression was the clearest she had seen on him, which was saying something for a man who was already quite clear. It was the expression of someone seeing something they had been hoping to see for a very long time. The ceremony was brief and genuine. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken by both of them with the conviction of people who had chosen these words specifically. And when it came to the part about love and cherishing, and whatever the future held, both of them said the words as if they meant each one. He put the turquoise ring on her finger and it fit, which delighted her because he had ordered it by estimation alone. The supper at the hotel was everything Margaret had promised, which was considerable, and the gathering of people who had come to witness two private, competent, slightly stubborn people decide to trust each other felt like exactly what a celebration ought to feel like. Henderson made a toast that was unexpectedly poetic for a man who usually spoke in 4 words when 4 would do. Dorothy wept decorously. James and Clara, sitting together, watched their mother laugh at something Paul said and exchanged the look of two people who have been privately rooting for something and have seen it through. Paul leaned toward her at one point during the supper and said quietly, "Are you happy?" She thought about it for a moment in the genuine way she thought about things, not performing the answer but finding it. "Yes," she said. "Actually and genuinely yes." He picked up her hand and held it under the table for the rest of the evening. They went out to the Carver property that night, which would be their permanent home once the addition was built, and the cabin was small and warm and entirely sufficient. Matilda had brought her most important things out the day before, and Paul had made space for them with the same thoughtful practicality he brought to everything. Her books were beside his books on the shelf, which looked, she thought, entirely natural. She stood at the window before bed looking at the desert under the stars, and Paul came to stand beside her, and they looked out together at the land that was theirs now, the mended fences and the spring planting and the wide darkness beyond. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it's a very big sky," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I think that's why I stayed." She turned to look at him in the dim light of the cabin. "I'm glad you did," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the solid, certain warmth of him, and the stars were extraordinary. The first summer of their marriage was busy in all the best ways. The addition to the cabin went up through May and June, Paul building it with James's help and occasional assistance from a couple of men in town who had offered to pitch in on a Saturday in exchange for Paul's help with their own projects later, which was the old economy of the frontier, and still the most reliable one. The addition gave them a proper bedroom, a second room that could serve as a study or a future nursery, and a wider kitchen that meant Matilda could both bake and think without feeling crowded. The store thrived. James was growing into his responsibility with the particular satisfaction of a young man who has found work that suits him. Clara had taken over the fabric and dressmaking supply section of the store with an organizational enthusiasm that actually improved Matilda's original arrangement, which Matilda acknowledged without too much difficulty because she was a fair-minded woman. Paul brought in 12 head of cattle in early June, good Texas stock he had sourced through a contact in Tucson, and the land which had been empty for years started to have the feel of a working ranch. He also continued to take on carpentry commissions in town, because he liked the work and liked contributing to the buildings that were making Redemption Creek permanent, and because the income was useful while the cattle operation was getting established. They settled into each other the way people settle into a house they intend to keep, learning the particular rhythms and requirements, adjusting without drama, building the small shared vocabulary of two people who live closely together. They disagreed sometimes, which was inevitable and, she found, entirely manageable when both parties were committed to resolution rather than winning. She discovered that he had a temper when things were done carelessly, not often but genuinely, and that it burned quick and clear, and was followed by an apology offered without artifice. He discovered that she could be inflexible when she had decided on something, and that the most productive approach was to make his case once clearly, and then let her work through to her own conclusion, which she usually did. She discovered that he sang, very quietly and not often, when he was working on something that required sustained attention. Old songs, cowboy songs, the kind that had traveled across the territory on cattle drives and mining camps and had no clear authorship but were known by everyone. She never mentioned it because she was afraid he would stop if he knew she had noticed. He discovered that she cried at stories, novels, and sometimes at accounts in the newspaper, and that she was slightly embarrassed by this, and he always pretended not to notice, which was the most respectful response possible. In August, Matilda realized she was pregnant. She was 43 years old and she had thought the possibility was behind her, had in fact assumed without much investigation that it was, which was perhaps naive of her but had seemed reasonable. She sat with this information for 3 days before she told Paul, not from concealment, but from the need to understand how she felt about it herself before she brought another person into the considering. She felt, when she finally sorted it out, a complicated combination of things. A surprise that was not quite shock, a joy that was not quite uncomplicated, and a fear that was entirely genuine, and that she decided to name clearly rather than allow to hide. She told him in the evening after supper while they were sitting on the porch in the summer dark. She told him directly in the way she told him everything. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm trying to determine that," she said honestly. "What do you need?" She looked at him. "I need you not to make a performance of your feelings about it until I've had a chance to finish forming mine." He nodded. "Fair enough." He took her hand. "I'll be right here while you do." She formed her feelings over the next week, slowly and honestly, and what she arrived at was this. She was going to be a mother again at 43, and she was frightened, and she was also, underneath the fear, genuinely glad. Life in the desert was full of second chances if you paid attention, plants blooming after drought, water appearing in dry creek beds after the rains. She had thought she was done with beginnings, and she had been wrong in more ways than one. She told Paul this as clearly as she had told him the other things, and he took both of her hands and looked at her with an expression she had no adequate words for except that it was the expression of a man who has been given something he did not dare to ask for. "A child," he said, as if hearing the word for the first time. "A child," she confirmed. He pressed her hands to his lips. "We'll take very good care," he said, "of you and of it." "Of course we will," she said practically. "We're very capable people." He laughed, the full laugh, the one that filled the space, and she felt the warmth of it settle around them both like something solid. James and Clara received the news with the characteristic reactions that Matilda could have predicted with reasonable accuracy. James was momentarily silent and then extended his hand to Paul and shook it with great seriousness, and then turned to Matilda and said, "Are you well?" And when she said yes, she was well, he nodded and seemed satisfied. Clara cried again, happy tears, and said that it was the best news she had heard in her entire life, which was perhaps an overstatement, but was offered with such genuine warmth that no one felt inclined to correct it. Dorothy, when informed, sat down and then immediately stood up and then sat down again, which was an unprecedented physical response for a woman of considerable composure. "Matilda Carver," she said, which was the first time Dorothy had used the new name and which struck Matilda as the moment it truly settled. "You are going to be absolutely fine." "I know," Matilda said, "but thank you." The autumn of 1883 was, in Matilda's considered opinion, the most beautiful she had seen in her 11 years in Arizona. She had always found the territory beautiful in the particular dramatic way of places that did not negotiate with the people living in them. But that fall, watching the desert move through its season from the porch of the cabin she had helped make into a home, she found a beauty in it that was personal in a way it had not been before. It was hers, she supposed, all of it, the land and the life on it. She continued to work in the store through November, which she had told Paul she intended to do, and which he had raised no objection to because he was sensible enough to know that telling Matilda Dalton Carver what she could and could not do with her own body and her own business was an exercise in futility. He did ride into town with her most days rather than going separately, which she did not mind. She found she did not mind most things about his companionship. She had thought she had become someone who preferred to be alone, and what she understood now was that she had become someone who preferred to be alone rather than in the wrong company. The right company was something she had simply stopped expecting. In December, she reduced her hours at the store to half days, and James and Clara managed the rest with a competence that made her genuinely proud. Her body was changing in the ways she remembered and some ways she did not, because 43 was not 30, and she was willing to admit that, though she declined to dramatize it. Paul was attentive without being hovering, which was the exact calibration she required. He noticed when she was tired and said nothing, but made it easier to rest. He built a low wooden platform along the side of the bed because she had mentioned once in passing that the step-up was farther than she preferred, and she came into the bedroom one evening to find it there and said nothing either, simply climbed into bed more easily and said good night. "The platform is very well made," she said into the dark. "It is," he agreed. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. The baby came in early March of 1884, which was a fine time in the desert, when the air was warm and the landscape was in its brief spectacular flowering. It was a boy, healthy and loud and emphatic about his arrival in the way of people who have decided that the world should know they are here. Matilda held him while Dorothy, who had served as the primary support through the labor with the calm authority of a woman who has been through difficult things and intends to get through this one too, did the necessary organizing. Paul was in the next room, and she could hear him through the wall, quiet in the way he was quiet when things mattered very much. Dorothy went to the door and said something to him, and a moment later he came in. He looked at her first, checking, the way he always checked on her before anything else. She met his eyes and gave him a slight nod, and something in him settled visibly. Then he looked at the baby. He sat carefully in the chair beside the bed, and she held the child out, and he took him with the careful steadiness of his hands, and he looked at his son with an expression that she knew she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life, regardless of how long that was. It was not a complicated expression. It was simply a man looking at something that has remade his understanding of what is possible. "Hello," Paul said quietly to the boy, who was looking back at him with the unfocused intentness of a newborn, finding everything interesting. They named him Robert Paul Carver, the first name for the man who had come before and made James and Clara and made Matilda into someone who knew what love required, and the second for the man who had come after and asked her to start again. James held his half-brother and looked at Matilda over the baby's head with an expression so full of conflicting and complicated things, love and loss and future all running together, that she reached up and put her hand on his face briefly the way she had done when he was small. "It's all right," she said. "There's room." "I know," he said. "I know there is." Clara held him and wept and told him he was going to be the most loved baby in the Arizona territory, which seemed a reasonable prediction. Dorothy held him and said he had good lungs and good color, and pronounced him satisfactory, which from Dorothy was high praise. The summer that Robert Paul Carver grew into was the summer the grain merchant storage building was completed, and the summer James took on his first solo carpentry commission, a porch extension for one of the newer houses on the west side of town, and did it exactly right. It was the summer Clara began to keep serious company with a young schoolteacher named Henry Marsh, no relation to Dorothy, who had come to Redemption Creek in the spring, and had the good sense to notice that Clara Dalton was a remarkable young woman. It was the summer the cattle herd grew to 25 head, and the summer Matilda began to teach Paul the particular accounting system she had developed for the store, because she wanted him to know it fully, and because she liked that they could sit at the table in the evenings with the ledger between them and talk about numbers with the same ease they talked about everything else. The Arizona territory was changing around them. The railroad was reshaping commerce and distances in ways both good and complicated. There were more people, more disputes, more growth. The Indian nations of the territory continued to suffer the consequences of policies that neither Matilda nor Paul could influence, but that they did not pretend away. And they spoke about these things when they came up with the same honesty they brought to everything, acknowledging that living in a place was not the same as approving of every force that had shaped it. Redemption Creek grew, and the Carver property grew with the place. A second barn going up in the fall of 1884, a proper chicken house that Clara had been advocating for since spring, a garden along the south wall that came up reliable and productive in the second year, once Matilda had understood what the desert soil required of her. Robert Paul, who was called Bobby with no one's conscious decision, but with everyone's natural agreement, grew with the satisfying rapidity of a healthy child well loved. He was a serious baby who became a curious toddler with a particular interest in watching his father work, which Paul encouraged by giving him small pieces of wood and teaching him the names of tools before he could properly hold them. He had Paul's dark eyes and Matilda's particular quality of looking at things as if they required consideration before responding, which made him seem, even at 1 year old, like someone who had opinions he was still formulating. Clara and Henry married in the spring of 1885, a wedding that was different in quality from Matilda and Paul's only in being louder, Clara having inherited none of her mother's preferences for quietude, and having inflated the guest list to a number that required Margaret to set up tables in the street outside the hotel. It was genuinely joyful, and Matilda sat beside Paul during the ceremony with Bobby on her lap and Paul's arm across the back of her chair, and she felt the particular fullness of a life that has more in it than you budgeted for. James had taken on a business partnership with a carpenter in Tucson, writing down their 2 weeks a month for shared commissions that were building him a reputation and a savings account. He had also been spending time with a young woman named Sarah Whitmore, who had come to Redemption Creek with her father when he took over the hardware store, and who was quiet and steady, and had the kind of clear competence that Matilda could see James finding restful after years of being the capable one himself. On a warm October evening in 1885, James came for Sunday supper and lingered after the meal when Clara and Henry had gone and Bobby was asleep, and it was just the three of them, James and Matilda and Paul, around the table with the lamp turned low and the coffee cups empty. "I'm thinking of asking Sarah Whitmore to marry me," James said. Paul refilled the coffee cups without being asked and sat back down. "Tell us about that," Matilda said. He told them. He told them carefully and honestly, the way he had learned, without theatrics but with genuine warmth. He told them about the things he valued in her, and the things he was uncertain of, and the way he thought the uncertainty was manageable. He told them he was aware that he was 22 years old and that some people would say that was young, and then he stopped and looked at Paul. "What do you think?" He asked Paul directly, which Matilda noted because it was the first time James had asked Paul for advice in quite that way, as a man asking another man whose judgment he trusted. Paul thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he said, "that age is considerably less important than clarity. And from what I hear, you're clear about what you want and clear about what she is. That's more than most people have at any age." He paused. "And I'll tell you what an older man told me once, which is that a good marriage is not about finding a perfect person. It's about being the kind of person who can build something good with someone who's genuinely trying to do the same." James was quiet. "Did someone actually tell you that?" "No," Paul said. "I made it up just now, but I believe it." James laughed, the rare, full laugh that he had been keeping more available lately. "Ask her," Matilda said simply. "And treat her well every day after." He did ask her, and Sarah said yes. And by the spring of 1886, James Dalton and Sarah Whitmore were married in the same small church where Matilda and Paul had been married 3 years before. And the fullness of that afternoon settled into Matilda's chest like something permanent. Bobby was 3 years old and served as the ring bearer with a concentration that was wholly disproportionate to the distance he had to walk, and that delighted every person in the pews. He delivered the ring pillow to the front of the church with the bearing of a head of state, and then turned to the audience and appeared to accept their admiration as his due before Paul collected him. Matilda watched Paul carry their son back to their pew, Bobby settling against his father's shoulder with the ease of a child who knows exactly where he is safe, and she thought about October of 1882, 4 years ago, when she had been sweeping her porch and trying very hard to be done with hope. She had been so certain, too old, too settled, too afraid. He had said he was older and asked her to start with him. She put her hand in his when he sat down, Bobby between them, and Paul looked at her the way he had looked at her from the very beginning, carefully and completely. "All right?" he asked quietly under the sound of the ceremony. "Very all right," she said. The years settled around Redemption Creek like the slow accumulation of good things. Bobby grew into a boy of genuine character, stubborn and curious and kind in ways that were recognizably his parents' and entirely his own. He learned to ride at 4 on a small pinto pony that Paul selected with the care of a man who understood that the first horse was formative. He learned to read at 5 from Matilda, who taught him with the patient precision of a woman who took all learning seriously, and he took to it with an enthusiasm that made her think of the essay collection she and Paul had read to each other in the evenings of their first winter together. Clara and Henry had a daughter in 1886 and named her Eileen or Me, the first name for Paul's late wife, which was a gesture of generosity and inclusion that made Paul quiet for an entire evening in the particular way that meant something deep had moved in him. She grew into a bright, vocal child who called Paul Grandpa Paul before anyone had quite decided what the terminology should be, and it stuck, because children have that power. James and Sarah had a son in 1887 that they named Thomas, and the Dalton Carver household expanded by the count of nieces and nephews who appeared regularly on Sundays, so that the cabin with its addition rang with noise and negotiation, and the particular beautiful chaos of an extended family that has chosen to stay within reach of each other. Paul's cattle operation grew to a proper ranch over those years, with a full-time hand named Aurelio, a Mexican man in his 30s who had come up from Sonora and who knew cattle with the deep knowledge of someone who had grown up among them. He was a quiet, capable man who Paul paid fairly and treated with the respect that Matilda thought should have been obvious, but was not always in the territory. Aurelio's wife Esperanza came the following year, and they built a small house on the east end of the property, and what had been the Henderson parcel, and then the Carver Ranch became something more like a small community. Matilda continued to run the store, though in a reduced capacity as the years went on, as James took over more of the primary operation, and she moved into the advisory role of someone whose knowledge is too valuable to lose, but who has earned the right to choose her hours. She kept the accounts herself until Bobby was old enough to learn them, and then she taught him too, because she believed in the same thing Paul's mother had believed in, that certain knowledge belonged in every capable person's hands. The store continued to thrive. Redemption Creek continued to grow. The Arizona Territory moved toward statehood through the 1880s and into the 1890s, with the complicated momentum of a place that had been shaped by violence and injustice, and also by genuine building, by people who came with nothing and made something, by families that put down roots in difficult soil and grew anyway. On a September evening in 1889, Matilda and Paul sat on the porch of the cabin, which had by now been so expanded and improved that calling it a cabin was a courtesy to its origins. The night was warm, the desert cooling slowly after the day's heat, and Bobby was inside trying to finish a drawing he had been working on, a picture of the ranch that he had been attempting to render accurately for 2 weeks, and that was getting better every attempt. The cattle were settled in the field, a comfortable lowing sound in the middle distance. Dutch had died the previous spring at a great age, and Paul had mourned him with a quiet dignity appropriate to the loss of a good companion. And the new horse, a young bay also named Dutch because Paul said there was no need to complicate things, was settled in the barn. "I was thinking today," Matilda said, "about October the first year." "When I came into the store," Paul said. "When you came into the store," she said. "I was dragging a flour barrel through the back door and trying to be done with hoping for things." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening sky. "Were you done with it?" "Almost," she said. "I had gotten very good at being almost done." "I noticed that about you," he said. "The first day, the way you had buttoned yourself up against expecting things." He paused. "It made you seem finished, but you weren't quite. There was still a readiness in you underneath." She thought about that. "Is that what you saw?" "That's what I hoped," he said. "I wasn't entirely certain." She laughed softly. "And yet you asked." "I was going to regret it either way," he said. "Better to regret asking than regret not asking." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had done so many thousands of times in the years between that first October and this one that it was as natural as breathing. He put his arm around her, the specific warmth of it, the particular weight of an arm that had been there through all the things that had happened since. "Paul," she said. "Matilda," he said. "I'm glad you asked." "So am I," he said. The porch light was warm and the stars were coming out one by one, and inside the house their sun was drawing the ranch, and the cattle were settling for the night, and the land that they had made together over 7 years stretched out before them into the dark, manageable and abundant and entirely theirs. Bobby came out with his drawing, holding it up in the lamplight. It was better than the previous attempt, recognizably the ranch, with the barn and the fences and the 2 figures on the porch that were unmistakably his parents, rendered in the honest lines of a child who was paying genuine attention to the world. "Is that us?" Matilda asked. "Yes," Bobby said, studying it critically. "The porch is wrong, I'll fix it." "Leave the people," Paul said. "They look exactly right." Bobby considered this and nodded and went back inside, and Paul and Matilda sat in the desert evening in the 7th year of their marriage, and the house was warm behind them and the land was good before them, and the stars over Arizona were what they had always been, vast and uncountable and entirely sufficient. She thought about the day she had looked at herself in the mirror before the wedding and seen a woman who was exactly her age. She had been right, of course. She was exactly her age. And her age had turned out to be precisely old enough to know what mattered, to choose it clearly, to build it well, and to keep it. She had been too old to start over, she had thought. He had said he was older and asked her to start with him. She understood now that starting over was the wrong name for it. Starting over implied leaving everything behind, going back to the beginning, erasing the history and trying again with a blank slate. That was not what had happened. What had happened was forward, not over. All of it, Robert and Alina and the years of loss and the 6 years alone and the children she had raised and the business she had built and the fear she had carried and the hope she had almost extinguished, all of it had come forward with her, present and accounted for, into the life they had made. Nothing was left behind. Everything was carried forward. That was the thing, she thought, leaning into the solid warmth of her husband under the September stars, that no one told you when they talked about second chances. A second chance was not a do-over. It was a continuation. It was the story going on with everything it had already accumulated into something more. Inside the house, Bobby sang something to himself, a half-remembered tune, one of the old cowboy songs his father sang quietly while he worked, the wordless kind that had traveled across the territory and belonged to everyone and no one. Paul heard it and smiled, and Matilda felt the smile against her hair. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder and held it, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said, lived, built, made real in the 7 years between that first October and this one, in the children asleep and growing in other houses nearby, in the land that was tended and the cattle that were settled and the store that was thriving and the accounts that balanced, and the small carved wooden figure that still sat on her dresser. A woman standing straight and clear-eyed exactly as she was. The night deepened, the stars multiplied. The desert breathed its slow, ancient breath around the house and the barn and the fences, around the property that had been empty and was now full, around two people who had found each other on the far side of grief and fear, and the quiet conviction that some seasons were finished, and had discovered together that the most important seasons of a life had not yet begun.